Have you heard about this thing called xylitol, but you're not sure how it helps or what it does? Well, in this video, I decided to dive deep into the xylitol rabbit hole to understand why it works, how you can do it, and I did something called xylitol pulling for a whole month, and I'll be sharing my experience about that too. In a nutshell, it's a way to improve your oral hygiene by swishing around some xylitol crystals in your mouth and then spitting it out. Curious? Interested? Let's begin. Now, first of all, how do you do xylitol pulling? You take a teaspoon of xylitol, around 5 grams, and you put it in your mouth. And then you swish it around. And what happens is that when you're swishing it around, the crystals break down and it also mixes with your saliva. So it promotes saliva production and it becomes this kind of like goopy thing that you're swishing around in your mouth. So you need to swish it around for at least 15 minutes. Once the 15 minutes is over, you can spit it out, and you can spit it out into the sink because it won't clog any drains. And that's it. That is one single xylitol pulling session. And all you need to do now is do it on a daily basis until you're happy with your oral hygiene. So whenever you're seeing a quote in this video, I am referencing a meta-analysis on xylitol, which includes 46 other smaller studies, and I kind of just like looked at it and broke it down into one big meta study. And if you want to have a link to that, then look down into the description and find all the studies for yourself. So why does it work? Now, there are actually a couple of studies that look into why xylitol is such an efficient way to fight cavities and plaque and bacteria in your mouth. So there are 4 different reasons, and let's go through them one by one. Quote, xylitol reduces the levels of MS and plaque by various mechanisms. So MS is Streptococcus mutans, which is pretty much the bacteria that causes cavities. Firstly, plaque microorganisms cannot ferment xylitol. The ability of certain organisms to ferment xylitol is negated by inaction of other plaque organisms, which prevent the plaque pH from falling. So what it's pretty much saying over here is that plaque cannot process xylitol, which prevents your mouth pH level from falling, which would otherwise lead to tooth decay. And tooth decay is bad. Now, quote, secondly, xylitol is incorporated into the cells of MS as xylitol 5-phosphate through the phosphoenol pyruvate phosphotransferase system. This results in inhibition of both growth and acid production. So a summary of that is that xylitol becomes a part of the Streptococcus mutans processing system, inhibiting the bacteria growth and acid production, which would lead to cavities and tooth decay. Thirdly, when exposed to xylitol, MS develop resistance to xylitol. These resistant strains are less virulent in an oral environment. So this one is really interesting. So the cavity bacteria adapts and mutates into a less harmful strain from the xylitol exposure. Fourthly, xylitol increases the concentration of ammonia and amino acids in plaque, thereby neutralizing plaque acids. You will have less plaque in your mouth because it's not as sticky as before. Now, some of the other benefits of xylitol pulling, or just xylitol usage in general, is increased saliva production. So that is really good because when you have more saliva in your mouth, or you're producing saliva, you're also increasing your appetite, and you're also just stimulating that saliva production, which also means that you're preventing a dry mouth. And speaking of dry mouth, when you have a dry mouth, you also usually have a lot of bacteria that starts to smell. So you actually get a fresher breath when you are doing this whole process because of that extra saliva production. Another benefit that xylitol has over something like oil pulling is that it actually targets specific bacteria compared to oil pulling, where it kind of like strips a lot of the bacteria, even the good bacteria that you have in your mouth. Now, I actually never found any downsides where I was kind of lacking bacteria in my mouth because of oil pulling. So I'm just curious as to what those good bacteria are and what I was missing out on. Now, the last big benefit of xylitol pulling that I want to mention actually is that you can spit it down the drain. Now, I've been yet again doing oil pulling for 3 or so years, and having to deal with the oil and spit it out in the green bin and freeze it and then toss it out and like worry about it leaking and so on. You don't need to worry about that with xylitol pulling because you just spit it down the drain. What are some downsides of xylitol pulling, or just a xylitol habit in general? Well, it's costly. Xylitol costs money, and it's something that you need to always have. Now, it's not that expensive. It's actually a bit cheaper when compared to things like oil pulling. So you can get this 1 kilo bag for around 30 Canadian dollars, and this would last you for quite some time. Another thing to mention is that xylitol is kind of like a new kid on the block. It's only been really studied for the last 50 or so years, and if you compare this to other techniques like oil pulling, it has been around for around 3,000 years of people using it. So xylitol and its usage for oral hygiene is just a very new phenomena that is not that well researched and studied just yet. So right now I'm going to share my personal experience with xylitol pulling. So overall, I felt like it did work. However, when I was comparing it to oil pulling, something I had done for years before this, I can say that the oil pulling experience made my mouth feel squeaky clean, while xylitol pulling maybe made my mouth feel around 70% of that cleanliness feel in my mouth. And it kind of makes sense because the way that xylitol functions compared to oil pulling is that xylitol wants you to maintain your flora in your mouth and kind of like cultivate those good bacteria that are in your mouth and minimize those bad bacteria by feeding them the equivalent of empty calories. So those bad bacteria are still in your mouth, but they are less potent, less virulent because you're not feeding them the substance that they need to thrive in your mouth. Another thing that I noticed was that my teeth were actually becoming a bit more sensitive. So I was chewing a bit and I felt like my teeth were just feeling the brunt of the chew just a bit more. And the last thing that I noticed was actually in the before and after pictures. So you can see here where I've done oil pulling for a year and a half, there is no kind of like darkness between my middle front teeth. And this is something that I guess is the buildup of that bacteria, both good and bad, that is causing this kind of like shadow of plaque slash bacteria to form. And it's interesting because I was actually on a minimal coffee kind of like stint throughout this experiment. So I kind of had like a 1 cup of coffee every week or so at a cafe, compared to when I was doing oil pulling, I was drinking coffee every single day. So the last question that I'm going to cover is if I am going to continue with xylitol pulling. Initially, I wanted to continue it for as long as I could, and 40 days was around as long as I could because I felt the downsides of xylitol pulling in comparison to oil pulling, and I had the craving to go back to oil pulling because I really liked that squeaky clean mouth feel. So no, I'm not going to continue xylitol pulling. I might re-explore it and see how it goes down the road if I learn something new about it or find a study seeing that I should be doing something very differently. But overall, after 40 days of exploring with xylitol pulling and trying it out and really giving it a shot, I've come to a conclusion for myself that it's not a technique that works well for me. And that's it for this video. I hope you've learned something about xylitol. If you have some other tidbits or facts, or if you want to share your own xylitol experience, well, comment those down below because I am always all ears to hear about how other people have experienced their journey with things like oil pulling, or in this case, xylitol pulling. Now, if you want to see some of my other videos talking about oil pulling, check out this video over here where I talk about my 3-month experience with oil pulling, or this chunky video over here that summarizes everything you need to know about oil pulling. That's it for this video. My name is Paul, and I'll see you later. Take care.